This is the image they told us could never happen. A satellite photograph, time-stamped Wednesday, April 9th, 2026, 2:17 a.m. local time, showing the skies above southern Israel lit up like the surface of the sun. Not fireworks, not a training exercise. What you are looking at is the terminal phase of a 1-200 missile ballistic salvo, the largest single missile attack in recorded human history, raining down on a 26 square kilometer complex in the Negev desert that houses Israel's most protected, most secret, most existentially critical military installation, the Negev Nuclear Research Center, Dimona. For the first time in history, a declared enemy state has deliberately, systematically, and with full command authorization targeted an operational nuclear weapons facility with a coordinated mass ballistic strike. Welcome to World Brief Daily. If you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit that button. Turn on notifications, because what you are about to hear is not speculation. It is not worst case scenario modeling. It is what happened. And if you do not understand every layer of what we are about to walk through, you will not understand why every government in the Western world quietly began emergency consultations within 4 hours of that first missile hitting the ground. We are talking about the collapse of Israel's Iron Dome and Arrow missile defense network under a saturation attack specifically engineered to overwhelm it. We are talking about the detonation of conventional warheads within confirmed proximity of declared and undeclared nuclear infrastructure. We are talking about a United States Fifth Fleet repositioning away from the theater, what military analysts are already calling, in language nobody in Washington wants to put on record, a strategic withdrawal. We are talking about oil markets seizing, emergency sessions at the UN Security Council, 3 NATO member governments convening extraordinary cabinet meetings before dawn. And we are talking about a nuclear ambiguity doctrine that Israel has maintained for 60 years, the policy of neither confirming nor denying its nuclear arsenal, being shredded in a single night. Buckle up. This goes deeper than anything you have seen covered anywhere else. And by the time we are done, you are going to understand not just what happened at Dimona, but why it changes everything about how this conflict ends. Let us start where we have to start, which is with Dimona itself, because if you think of Dimona as simply an Israeli military base, you do not have the full picture. The Negev Nuclear Research Center at Dimona is the crown jewel, the nerve center, the irreplaceable heart of Israel's strategic deterrence posture. Built in the late 1950s with French technical assistance, operational since approximately 1962, it has never been officially acknowledged by the Israeli government as a weapons facility. But sources inside the Western intelligence community, speaking to journalists from multiple outlets over the past decade, have described a facility that includes a plutonium production reactor, a reprocessing plant, a weapons fabrication complex, tritium production capabilities, and an underground warren of laboratories and storage vaults extending multiple stories beneath the desert floor. Foreign policy analysts with access to declassified assessments have estimated Israel's nuclear stockpile at between 80 and 400 warheads. The exact figure is unknown. What is not unknown is this: all of the infrastructure required to produce, maintain, and potentially deploy those weapons runs through Dimona. Now let us talk about what Iran sent at it. According to open source radar tracking data reviewed by military analysts following the April 9th attack, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force launched a coordinated salvo involving an estimated 1,200 ballistic missiles, including Shahab-3 medium-range variants, Imad precision-guided missiles, Gadr series warheads, and Khaybar-Shikan hypersonic-capable systems, along with an estimated 400 to 600 Shahed series drones launched in simultaneous waves designed to saturate Israeli air defense radar systems. Sources inside the Israeli Defense Forces, speaking on condition of anonymity to regional media, described the incoming volume as unlike anything the system had been stress tested against. That is a critical phrase, stress tested against, because Israel's layered missile defense architecture, Iron Dome for short-range threats, David's Sling for medium range, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 for ballistic intercepts at altitude, was designed with specific saturation thresholds. According to defense industry sources cited by Jane's Defense Weekly, those thresholds were not modeled for simultaneous engagements exceeding approximately 350 to 500 high-trajectory ballistic threats. Iran sent more than twice that number, with coordinated drone swarms on top. Here's what you need to understand about saturation attacks. The math is brutally simple. Every interceptor missile costs money. Iron Dome interceptors cost approximately $50,000 to $100,000 per unit. Arrow 3 interceptors run an estimated $2 million to $3 million per unit. A Shahab 3 ballistic missile costs Iran approximately $500,000 to $1 million to produce. When you launch 1-200 of them simultaneously, you are not trying to guarantee that every missile hits its target. You are trying to guarantee that your enemy runs out of interceptors before you run out of missiles. That is the doctrine. That is what Iran executed on the night of April 9th. And according to leaked intelligence assessments cited by the Times of Israel, Israel's Arrow 3 battery at the Palmakim Air Base, the primary Dimona coverage battery, expended its full complement of ready interceptors within 11 minutes of engagement initiation. 11 minutes. After that, the remaining inbound missiles were engaged by secondary and tertiary systems at degraded effectiveness, with confirmed impacts beginning at approximately 2:34 a.m. local time. But here is the catch, and this is where the story becomes truly catastrophic in its implications. According to statements from the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission released through the Prime Minister's office at 6:15 a.m. on April 9th, the confirmed impacts occurred at the outer perimeter of the Dimona complex, specifically targeting what Israeli officials described as administrative facilities, security outposts, and ancillary infrastructure. The reactor core and primary processing facilities, they stated, sustained no direct hits. No radiation release was detected. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi confirmed this in a statement issued at 8 a.m. Vienna time, noting that radiation monitoring data from regional stations showed no anomalous readings. That is the good news. Hold on to it, because everything else that surrounds it is catastrophe at a scale this region has never experienced. The first dimension of catastrophe is the sheer demonstration effect. Iran did not need to destroy Dimona to achieve its strategic objective on April 9th. What Iran needed to do was prove it could reach Dimona, that it could overwhelm Israel's defenses, that the nuclear ambiguity doctrine, the shield behind which Israel has operated for 6 decades, could be pierced. Before April 9th, 2026, there was a foundational assumption embedded in every strategic calculation in the Middle East, that Israel's nuclear facilities were effectively untouchable, that any adversary willing to target them would face certain annihilation before sufficient missiles could penetrate the defensive perimeter. Iran has now detonated that assumption as surely as its warheads detonated in the Negev sand. Sources inside the Pentagon, speaking to Reuters correspondents embedded with Central Command, described senior military officials as, quote, visibly shaken by the intercept failure rate. The intercept failure rate. That phrase is the epicenter of everything that follows. Nobody is talking about what that failure rate actually means for the next phase of this conflict. So let us talk about it. According to defense analyst assessments published in the hours following the attack, the Arrow 3 system achieved an estimated 60 to 70% intercept rate against the highest priority threats. That sounds high until you do the arithmetic on 1-200 incoming missiles. A 65% intercept rate against 1-200 missiles means approximately 420 missiles impacted in Israeli territory, 420 warheads, in a country the physical size of New Jersey. The fires visible from satellite imagery over the Negev, the Arava Valley, and the northern approaches to Dimona were not the fires of a close call. They were the fires of a nation whose defensive doctrine had just been empirically stress tested at maximum load and found insufficient. And according to Israeli emergency medical sources cited by Haaretz, the casualty figures from the broader strike zone, not limited to the Dimona perimeter, were being described in classified briefings as, and we are paraphrasing the source language here, the worst single-day toll since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That is what the defense failure actually means, translated into human terms. Now let us talk about the United States. because this is the dimension that is generating the most controlled fury in Washington right now and the most carefully worded, almost deliberately misleading public statements. At approximately 3:45 a.m. on April 9th, multiple defense reporters covering the Navy's Fifth Fleet movements in the Persian Gulf and Eastern Mediterranean noted unusual repositioning activity. According to U.S. Naval Institute sources, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which had been operating in the Eastern Mediterranean in a deterrence posture since the conflict began on February 28th, began moving southwestward, away from the Israeli coastline, away from the engagement zone, at approximately the same time Iran's second missile wave was being tracked on radar. The official U.S. Central Command statement, released 6 hours later, described this movement as a, quote, tactical repositioning consistent with operational security protocols. Sources inside the administration tell a different story. According to 3 officials with direct knowledge of the National Security Council emergency session convened at 11 p.m. Eastern Time on April 8th, the night the launch was first detected, the decision to move the Ford Strike Group was made at the highest levels of the U.S. government before a single Arrow 3 interceptor had been fired. The calculation, according to these sources, was straightforward and devastating in its implications. If Israel's defenses were overwhelmed and Dimona's secondary systems were somehow engaged, the proximity of American naval assets created an unacceptable escalation risk vis-a-vis Iran's stated targeting doctrine. Translation: we moved the fleet because we were not confident we could protect it if the situation at Dimona escalated beyond conventional parameters. It gets worse, because the repositioning of the Gerald R. Ford was not the only American movement on the night of April 9th. According to reports from Al-Monitor and satellite imagery analysis conducted by Planet Labs and reviewed by defense journalists, U.S. Air Force assets at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the forward headquarters of U.S. Air Force's Central Command, began dispersal protocols at approximately 4 a.m. Gulf Standard Time on April 9th. F-22 Raptors, F-15E Strike Eagles, B-52 Stratofortresses, aircraft worth billions of dollars in aggregate, representing the most concentrated American air power in the region, began relocating to secondary dispersal fields in Oman, Bahrain, and farther west. This was not a coincidence. This was a theater-wide posture adjustment. Sources inside CENTCOM describe it in private as a, quote, escalation ladder management decision made in recognition that a strike on Dimona, even a failed strike, represented a category of event for which standing rules of engagement were not adequate. But here is the word that official Washington will not use, the word that our allies in Europe are using in private cables, the word that Houthi propaganda and Iranian state media have been broadcasting on loop since dawn on April 9th: retreat. The United States retreated. We need to stop here for a moment and acknowledge something that is not comfortable to say on this channel or anywhere else. The repositioning of American assets in the hours following the Dimona attack represents the most significant visible diminishment of American deterrence credibility in the Middle East since the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis. That is not hyperbole. That is the assessment being offered by former national security advisors, by retired CENTCOM commanders, by analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and the Atlantic Council, organizations that span the political spectrum. Sources reportedly inside the Joint Chiefs of Staff describe internal debate as, quote, the most contentious since the 2011 Libya intervention. Because here is what the optics communicate to every state actor watching, and they are all watching. If the United States will reposition its carrier group away from a direct strike on its closest regional ally's nuclear facility, then the credibility of the American nuclear umbrella extended over every NATO ally, every Gulf state partner, every security guarantee we have made to every nation in this region is now a subject of legitimate interrogation. Watch what happens in the coming weeks. Watch Saudi Arabia's posture toward its own defense procurement. Watch South Korea's language around its own nuclear deterrence debate. Watch Poland. Watch Japan. Every one of those governments is running the same calculation right now. Let us talk about Iran's strategic logic, because this attack did not emerge from nowhere. It was, according to sources inside the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's strategic planning apparatus cited by Tasnim news agency, Iran's semi-official military media, the culmination of a doctrine known internally as Qiyamah al-Quds, or the Jerusalem Reckoning. The doctrine, reportedly approved by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei following the February 28th U.S.-Israeli opening strikes, proceeds from a specific military strategic premise. Israel without its nuclear deterrent is a conventional military problem. Israel with its nuclear deterrent is an existential threat. Therefore, the path to survival for the Islamic Republic runs through making Israel's nuclear deterrent non-credible, not by destroying it, by demonstrating that it can be reached, that the delivery systems can be degraded, that the facilities themselves are vulnerable to sustained conventional attack. The April 9th strike was not designed to cause a nuclear event. It was designed to create a nuclear dilemma. And according to the data, it has succeeded. Leaked assessments from Israeli military intelligence cited by Ynet News describe the Dimona complex as, following the April 9th strike, operating under a, quote, degraded security posture with confirmed structural damage to outer perimeter facilities, power grid disruption affecting secondary systems, and 3 confirmed personnel casualties among the complex's physical protection staff. 3 people killed at Dimona. That has never happened before in the 60-year history of that facility. Now let us construct the worst-case scenario, and I want to be precise about this. We are not predicting this outcome. We are describing what the technical architecture of the situation makes possible if certain conditions obtain in the coming days and weeks. Worst case scenario 1, Iran launches a follow-on salvo within 72 hours of the April 9th attack. This is not hypothetical. According to satellite imagery reviewed by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, Iranian mobile launch vehicles, transporter erector launchers, or TELs in the technical terminology, were observed relocating to secondary firing positions within 6 hours of the April 9th salvo's completion. The doctrine for this is straightforward and terrifying. Hit the target, watch the defender expend interceptors, allow the defense to partially reload, then hit again before the reload is complete. Israeli Arrow 3 batteries, according to defense industry sources, require between 24 and 72 hours to fully restock interceptor magazine capacity. If Iran strikes again within that reloading window, Israeli air defenses would be engaging the second wave at significantly reduced effectiveness, potentially as low as 30 to 40% of baseline capability. Against another 1-200 missile salvo, the arithmetic of what would reach Dimona's inner perimeter becomes, according to multiple independent analysts, deeply alarming. The IAEA's 7 pillars of nuclear safety in conflict zones, reactor integrity, off-site power, cooling systems, physical protection, emergency response, communication with regulators, and radiation monitoring would face simultaneous stress on multiple axes. A compromised reactor is not necessarily a catastrophic event, but a reactor under sustained attack with degraded cooling systems, reduced physical protection, and compromised emergency response capabilities operating in an active war zone begins to approach the territory of scenarios that the global nuclear safety community has never had to manage in real time. Here is worst case scenario 2, and this is the one that no one in official Washington will say out loud, but every strategic planner is gaming. Israel retaliates against Iran's own nuclear infrastructure. The Fordo enrichment facility buried under 80 to 100 meters of mountain rock near Qom, the Natanz underground enrichment complex, the Isfahan uranium conversion facility. If Israel concludes, and the political pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu's government to conclude exactly this is, according to sources close to the cabinet, overwhelming, that the Dimona strike represents an Iranian crossing of a fundamental red line. The response options available to the Israeli Air Force are limited but nuclear adjacent in their targeting. The United States has reportedly lobbied through back-channel communications cited by Axios national security reporter Barak Ravid against any Israeli strike on Fordo specifically on the grounds that penetrating Fordo's underground infrastructure would require bunker-busting munitions of a yield that risks spreading radiological material from Iran's existing enriched uranium stockpiles. That stockpile, according to the IAEA's most recent safeguards report published before the conflict began, included approximately 275 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, a quantity that, if dispersed in an uncontrolled radiological event, would create contamination extending beyond Iran's borders. The Strait of Hormuz would become a contamination zone. Shipping would halt. Oil markets would not just spike, they would seize. The cascading economic consequences of a contaminated Strait of Hormuz are incalculable. We are talking about a potential disruption to approximately 20% of global oil supply, measured not in days but in months. We are talking about Brent crude prices that some commodity analysts have privately modeled at $180 to $200 per barrel within 30 days of such an event. We are talking about an immediate, catastrophic global recession. Now, let us go deeper on the financial architecture of what has already happened, because the Dimona attack did not wait for worst-case scenarios to move markets. The damage is already being measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. Brent crude had already risen approximately 35% from its pre-conflict baseline of $74 per barrel since the February 28th opening strikes. On the morning of April 9th, within 2 hours of the first confirmed reports of missiles impacting near Dimona, Brent crude spiked an additional $14.73 per barrel in after-hours trading, the largest single-day intraday move since the 2020 COVID demand collapse. War risk insurance premiums for tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz, which had already risen from a baseline of approximately 0.3% of vessel value to over 2.8% since February, jumped an additional 1.4 percentage points overnight. That number sounds abstract until you understand what it means practically. A very large crude carrier, a supertanker carrying 2 million barrels of oil, worth approximately $100 million costs its operator an additional $1.4 million per voyage just in insurance on top of the existing premium increases. Shipping companies do not absorb those costs. They pass them. And the entity at the end of the cost passing chain is you, filling up your gas tank, heating your home, paying the delivery surcharges on everything you buy online. According to the American Petroleum Institute, every $10 increase in crude oil translates to approximately 24 cents per gallon at the pump for American consumers. The April 9th spike alone represents roughly 35 cents per gallon before refinery margins and distribution costs. Your wallet is already in this war. The Israeli shekel collapsed 8.7% against the dollar in the first 3 hours of trading on April 9th. The worst single session performance in the currency's history. Tel Aviv Stock Exchange trading was halted after the TA35 index fell 11.2% at the open. Moody's and Fitch both placed Israel's sovereign credit rating on negative watch within 24 hours, citing, in Moody's language, a material deterioration of the security environment affecting both fiscal stability and institutional continuity. That last phrase, institutional continuity, is analyst language for a very specific fear, that the Israeli government's ability to function as a stable governing entity is in question. According to Israeli central bank data, foreign reserve drawdowns in the 72 hours following the attack totaled approximately $4.3 billion as the Bank of Israel intervened to defend the shekel. That pace, if sustained for 2 weeks, would consume approximately $30 billion of Israel's $212 billion in foreign reserves, not an existential fiscal threat in isolation, but a number that tells you how much the market believes this is over. Let us talk about the constitutional and political implosion happening simultaneously inside Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu convened an emergency war cabinet session at 3 a.m. on April 9th, within 45 minutes of the first confirmed impact reports. According to Israeli political sources cited by Channel 12 News, the session immediately fractured along lines that had been building since the February 28th opening strikes. Defense Minister Israel Katz reportedly demanded immediate authorization for a retaliatory strike targeting Iranian nuclear infrastructure, arguing that the Dimona attack crossed every red line established in Israeli nuclear doctrine. Sources describe him as, quote, physically pounding the table. Benny Gantz, the opposition leader who had rejoined the emergency war cabinet following the February 28th escalation, reportedly argued for 48 hours of American consultation before any retaliatory authorization. The IDF chief of staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, according to the same sources, presented an assessment that retaliation options targeting Iranian nuclear sites carried an estimated 60% probability of prompting an Iranian ballistic response against Israeli population centers within 90 minutes, response volumes that Israeli defense systems, in their currently degraded interceptor posture, could not fully absorb. 60%. That is not a risk calculation. That is a near coin flip on catastrophe. And it is the calculation sitting in front of Netanyahu's war cabinet right now. Sources inside the Israeli intelligence community describe to Haaretz the psychological atmosphere in the Kiryat, Israel's military headquarters complex in Tel Aviv, as the darkest in recent memory. That is language that carries enormous weight in Israeli military culture. The Kiryat has operated through the 1973 war, the First Lebanon War, the Second Intifada, multiple Gaza campaigns, the October 7th massacre. The word darkest in recent memory from people with that institutional memory is not rhetorical flourish. It is a data point about institutional confidence. Here is the psychological architecture of what Dimona represents to Israeli society. Israel has maintained its nuclear ambiguity not just as a military strategy, but as a psychological anchor. The implicit promise of the ambiguity doctrine was this: whatever happens, the state will survive. There is an ultimate guarantee, a final deterrent, an insurance policy written in physics. What the April 9th attack did was not destroy that insurance policy. It demonstrated that the vault containing it could be reached. That is a different kind of damage. It is psychological infrastructure damage. And according to sources inside Israeli civil society organizations, polling conducted in the 48 hours following the attack showed a 22-point collapse in public confidence in the government's ability to defend the country. 22 points in 48 hours. Now let us go to the international dimension, because this is where the story reaches truly global proportions. Russia's reaction to the Dimona attack was, according to Kremlin spokeswoman Maria Zakharova's statement, one of, and we are paraphrasing here, extreme alarm regarding the potential for nuclear escalation in the region. That is remarkable language from a government that has been, throughout this conflict, maintaining studied neutrality between its Iranian partner and its complicated relationship with Israel. Russia has approximately 190 personnel still at the Bushehr nuclear power plant, or whatever remains operational there after the April 4th strike we covered in our last episode. Moscow has compelling reasons to want nuclear escalation contained, but Russia's alarm statement came with a specific and pointed reference. Zakharova explicitly noted that Western condemnation of the Dimona strike was, in her words, categorically more urgent than the condemnation applied to strikes on the Bushehr reactor by the U.S.-Israeli coalition. That asymmetry argument, again, Russia is using it, Iran is using it, and it is landing in global South capitals, New Delhi, Ankara, Riyadh, Cairo, Jakarta, in ways that the United States government appears to be systematically underestimating. According to diplomatic sources cited by Foreign Policy magazine, the G20 WhatsApp channel, yes, that is an actual thing, a private communication channel among G20 heads of state and foreign ministers, was, in the hours following the Dimona attack, described by one Western European participant as, quote, an avalanche of messages that I have never seen the likes of before in 7 years of this work. Every government in the world is measuring its exposure right now. Every government is calculating whether the framework of rules, norms, and mutual deterrence that has prevented nuclear use since 1945 is being systematically dismantled in the Negev desert. China's response was the most carefully calibrated. State-owned Xinhua issued a brief statement calling for, quote, all parties to exercise maximum restraint and avoid any action that could trigger irreversible consequences. That language, irreversible consequences, is Chinese diplomatic code for nuclear use. Beijing is signaling that it sees this conflict as approaching a threshold it is not willing to silently witness cross. According to sources inside the State Department cited by Politico, the Biden administration, or rather the current administration, operating under its own strategic framework, received a private communication from Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi within 6 hours of the Dimona attack that was described by a senior State Department official as, quote, the most direct Chinese engagement on Middle East nuclear risk management that we have seen from Beijing in 20 years. 20 years. The Chinese are not passive observers in this story. They have $200 billion in Belt and Road infrastructure investments in the Gulf region. They import approximately 1.8 million barrels per day from Iranian production under gray market arrangements. A radiological event in the Gulf, a contaminated Strait of Hormuz, a collapse of oil infrastructure in a war that metastasizes into nuclear use. These are not abstract geopolitical concerns for Beijing. They are immediate, existential economic threats. Let us now go deep on the historical precedents because this moment has predecessors, and understanding those predecessors is the only way to understand the range of possible futures. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 is the obvious reference point, and it is worth examining precisely rather than simply invoking it as shorthand for nuclear peril. What made the Cuban Missile Crisis resolvable was not American military superiority, though that existed. It was the existence of a direct, functioning, high-trust communication channel between Kennedy and Khrushchev, through which both sides were able to signal red lines, offer face-saving exits, and ultimately construct a de-escalation framework that neither could have publicly proposed without being politically destroyed. The Kennedy-Khrushchev back channel was an engineering marvel of diplomatic communication. Ask yourself, does that channel exist today between Tehran and Jerusalem? Between Tehran and Washington? The ceasefire talks currently underway in Islamabad, according to sources cited by Al Jazeera, have been described by Iranian negotiators as, quote, conditionally suspended following the April 9th attack, pending clarification of Israeli retaliatory intent. Conditionally suspended. That is diplomatic language for, we are still at the table, but we have one foot out the door, and we are watching what you do next. The 1973 Yom Kippur War offers a second historical lens, and it is one that the Israeli military establishment is invoking in its own internal assessments. In October 1973, Israel faced a coordinated surprise attack from Egypt and Syria that in its opening hours came genuinely close to overrunning Israeli defensive lines on both the southern Sinai and northern Golan fronts. The IDF was losing, not slowly, rapidly, and according to multiple historical accounts from former Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, Prime Minister Golda Meir, and IDF Chief of Staff David Elazar, at some point between October 8th and October 9th of 1973, Israel made a preliminary decision to authorize the preparation of nuclear weapons for potential use, what became known in Israeli military history as the Samson option, the last resort doctrine of using nuclear weapons if the state's survival appeared existentially threatened. That authorization was never executed. American resupply of conventional munitions, combined with the Israeli military's recovery of tactical momentum, removed the existential pressure before the threshold was crossed. The question being asked in every intelligence capital in the world tonight is whether Israel's current situation, its conventional defenses partially degraded, its nuclear facilities struck, its American patron visibly repositioning, approaches the psychological threshold at which that Samson option calculus re-enters the War Cabinet's operational frame. Sources inside Israeli military doctrine think tanks, speaking with profound reluctance to journalists they trust, are using a phrase that should chill everyone who hears it: threshold ambiguity. They are no longer certain, they say, that the Samson option threshold is as distant as it was on April 8th. The 1981 Osirak precedent is the third historical reference that matters here, and it runs in the opposite direction from the others. In June 1981, Israeli Air Force F-16s destroyed Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in a unilateral preemptive strike. Prime Minister Menachem Begin justified the attack by articulating what became known as the Begin Doctrine. Israel will not permit any adversarial state in the region to develop nuclear weapons or the infrastructure required to do so. The international reaction at the time was condemnation. The United Nations Security Council unanimously voted to censure Israel. But the Osirak strike held. Iraq never rebuilt its reactor. The Begin Doctrine became the foundational logic for Israeli preemptive action against regional nuclear programs, a doctrine invoked again in the 2007 strike on Syria's Al-Kabar reactor. The question now is whether a reciprocal Dimona doctrine is being articulated in Tehran, whether Iran has, through the April 9th attack, established its own precedent, that Israel's nuclear infrastructure is a legitimate military target, that the architecture of nuclear ambiguity is itself a form of first strike capability, and that it has the means and the will to reach it. If Iran has established that precedent without suffering consequences that make the precedent untenable, the Dimona Doctrine will be studied, copied, and eventually applied by every adversary that possesses sufficient ballistic missile range. North Korea has studied this conflict with extraordinary attention. So has Pakistan's ISI. So has every military planner with a capable missile force and a regional adversary with a nuclear program. Here is the nuclear safety dimension that is not receiving the attention it deserves. The IAEA's 7 indispensable pillars of nuclear safety: physical integrity of the reactor, uninterrupted off-site power, functioning cooling systems, effective physical protection, adequate emergency preparedness, reliable radiation monitoring, and continuous communication with regulators are not independent variables. They are interdependent. Degrade one and you stress the others. The Dimona facility does not use the same commercial reactor architecture as Bushehr. It is a heavy water research reactor of a type originally derived from the French EL3 design, operating at relatively low power levels by commercial standards. Its primary radiological risk is not a Chernobyl-scale reactor explosion. The physics of its design make that type of event extremely unlikely. The risk is from the reprocessing facilities, which contain quantities of separated plutonium and radioactive waste streams that, if physically disrupted, could create a localized but persistent radiological contamination event. According to former IAEA officials cited by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, even a modest radiological release from the Dimona site's chemical processing infrastructure could render portions of the Negev uninhabitable for between 10 and 30 years, depending on wind patterns and the volume of material dispersed. The prevailing winds in the Negev during April blow northwestward toward the most densely populated portions of Israel. That is the technical mechanism of the nightmare scenario. That is why the IAEA Director General's language, his references to vital safety equipment in auxiliary buildings, his call for maximum military restraint, his reiteration of the 7 pillars, is not bureaucratic formality. It is a measured warning from the world's foremost nuclear safety authority that the margin for error in what is happening at Dimona has become dangerously thin. Now let us construct the broader strategic picture, because what we are witnessing is not one crisis. We are witnessing 5 simultaneous crises converging on a single pressure point. First, the military crisis, in which Israel's defensive doctrine has been empirically demonstrated to be insufficient against a sufficiently resource saturation attack. That is now a permanent feature of the strategic landscape. Second, the deterrence crisis, in which the credibility of both Israeli nuclear deterrence and American extended deterrence in the region has been publicly questioned in ways that will take years to reconstruct, if they can be reconstructed at all. Third, the nuclear safety crisis, in which an operational facility with weapons-grade materials is operating in an active war zone under sustained attack with degraded physical security and power infrastructure, monitored by an international agency whose authority all parties nominally respect, but none of them are actually obeying. Fourth, the economic crisis: oil at 108 TN per barrel and rising, tanker insurance at historic premiums, Israeli financial markets in controlled collapse, and a global supply chain already stressed by 3 years of post-pandemic restructuring, now facing a potential energy price shock that economic models describe as recessionary if sustained beyond 60 days. Fifth, the diplomatic crisis, in which the ceasefire framework being assembled in Islamabad has been, according to multiple sources, severely destabilized by the April 9th attack, with both Iranian and Israeli negotiating delegations, neither of which was in Islamabad by choice, neither of which trusts the other, neither of which has a political mandate to make concessions, now operating under the shadow of a military escalation that neither their governments nor their publics are prepared to accept as the status quo. What has been lost? Let us be precise. The way this story demands precision. The doctrine of nuclear site immunity, the informal but globally observed norm that nuclear facilities, even those with military dimensions, are not legitimate targets for conventional attack, has been fractured, not shattered, fractured, because no radiological event occurred, because the IAEA is still on site, because monitoring continues and finds nothing. The fracture is contained. But the architecture that held that norm in place, deterrence, intercept capability, American extended security guarantees, the implicit understanding that certain targets are existentially too dangerous to strike, that architecture has been visibly degraded. And degraded architecture does not announce its failure with a single catastrophic collapse. It announces it with a crack, then another crack. Then, if the load is not reduced, with sounds that no one wants to hear. Here is what history teaches about this exact moment. When a great power's deterrence credibility is publicly questioned and the power fails to respond with sufficient force to restore it, the cycle of testing accelerates. Not because adversaries are irrational, but because they are rational. They see an exposed flank, they probe it again. The 1930s provide the most painful illustration of this mechanism. Every accommodation of German aggression, every Rhineland, every Anschluss, every Sudetenland reduced the cost of the next transgression in Hitler's calculation. We do not invoke this parallel casually. We invoke it because the strategic logic is identical, regardless of the actors and the specific context. When red lines are crossed without consequence, they cease to be red lines. They become suggestions. And in a theater where the stakes include nuclear facilities and the populations downwind of them, suggestions are not an adequate deterrent architecture. The Islamabad ceasefire talks are now the thread on which this story pivots. Sources inside the Pakistani Foreign Ministry, cited by Dawn newspaper, describe the talks as having been moved from the planned negotiating venue to a secure governmental facility following security concerns that emerged in the 24 hours after the Dimona attack. Iran's chief negotiator, according to Al Jazeera's Islamabad correspondent, arrived at the session on April 10th with a written mandate from Supreme Leader Khamenei that, sources say, has been materially altered from the mandate that governed the pre-April 9th negotiating posture. The alteration, according to a source with direct knowledge, introduced a new condition. Any agreement must include a binding, internationally guaranteed prohibition on future strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. That is Iran using the Bushehr strikes and the Dimona reciprocity argument as a single negotiating lever. It is smart diplomacy from a position of military strength, the strength of having just demonstrated that it can reach Dimona, but it is also a formulation that Israel and the United States are, according to administration sources cited by Politico, entirely unwilling to codify in any legally binding agreement. Which means the gap between the parties' core negotiating positions has, in the 24 hours since the Dimona attack, not narrowed. It has widened. Watch what happens in the next 72 hours. Watch whether Israeli Air Force activity over Iranian territory increases or decreases. Watch the IAEA's daily briefings on Dimona and Bushehr with the attention of someone whose life depends on them. Because depending on where you live in the Gulf region, it might. Watch the Israeli shekel and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange as leading indicators of Israeli cabinet decision-making. Markets see decisions before they are announced. Watch the movements of U.S. naval assets in the eastern Mediterranean with the specific attention of someone tracking whether the Gerald R. Ford strike group moves back toward the Israeli coastline. If it moves back, that is a signal that Washington has decided deterrence credibility requires visible recommitment. If it does not move back within 96 hours, sources inside the defense community say that absence becomes its own signal, one that every adversary of the United States will be reading with enormous care. Let us end where we must end, with the question that sits beneath all of the tactical and strategic analysis. We have spent the last hour walking through missile trajectories, intercept rates, financial contagion, diplomatic frameworks, and historical analogies. But beneath all of it is a simpler and more profound question. Are the decision makers on all sides of this conflict capable of finding an exit ramp before one of these crises metastasizes beyond recovery? The Cuban Missile Crisis ended because Kennedy and Khrushchev were, at the critical moment, rational actors capable of imagining their own destruction clearly enough to prefer a humiliating compromise over a catastrophic escalation. Are Netanyahu, Khamenei, and the American president capable of that same imaginative clarity right now? The data is not reassuring. Netanyahu faces a domestic political environment in which any agreement that does not include ironclad security guarantees will be portrayed by his coalition partners as surrender. Khamenei faces a domestic political environment in which the Dimona strike has been framed by state media as a historic victory, creating public expectations that cannot be easily managed down into a modest negotiated settlement. And the United States faces a credibility problem of its own construction, having repositioned its fleet, having failed to prevent the Dimona strike despite being the military guarantor of Israeli security, now under pressure to demonstrate that its commitments mean something while simultaneously trying to prevent an escalation that its own military commanders privately describe as beyond their ability to control if it crosses certain thresholds. The sound you heard echoing across the Negev desert in the early hours of April 9th, 2026, 1,200 warheads descending on the most sensitive installation in the Middle East, was not just a military event. It was an announcement that the deterrence architecture of the post-Cold War Middle East, assembled over 60 years through nuclear ambiguity and American extended deterrence and the informal but real norm of nuclear site immunity, has entered its terminal stress test. Whether it passes or fails will be determined not by the missiles already fired, but by the decisions made in the next 72 hours. By men in war cabinets who are exhausted, who are frightened, who are operating under political pressures that push toward escalation and strategic calculations that point toward catastrophe. Pray they find the exit and stay with us, because this story is not over, not even close. If this analysis gave you a clearer understanding of the most dangerous nuclear confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you already know exactly what to do. Subscribe to World Brief Daily, turn on your notifications, and stay with us because the next chapter of this story is already being written, and you need to understand every word of it.